Hello, and welcome back to my channel, where I summarize and spoil classic books that you may have forgotten the plot to. Today, we're covering 1984 by George Orwell. Let's get into it. Just a quick content warning. This book can be a bit foul, especially toward the end. So if that's not something you want to hear, I completely understand. 1984, written by George Orwell, is an alternative history novel where after World War II, we had nuclear fallout, and now the world is controlled by three totalitarian governments. Our main character, Winston Smith, is actually a member of one of these governments, simply known as the Party. He works in the Ministry of Truth, where his job is to literally rewrite history, to align it with current political views. This is one of the many tactics used by the Party to essentially brainwash the public. Another prominent item of propaganda that is featured in this novel is something called newspeak. It is a form of the English language that actually entirely gets rid of words, even revolving around rebellion, to try to squash the ideas of it. And it promotes something called doublethink, where you believe contradictory things at the same time. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength, etc. And all of this propaganda is used to uplift their leader, simply known as Big Brother. But Winston does not actually support the Party. As the novel opens, he is expressing his disdain for the Party's absolute control over people's lives. They do not allow expressions of individuality, love, sex, or even free thought, going so far as to have the thought police. Winston is actually fascinated with the main rebellious group in this universe called the Brotherhood, and he believes one of his co-workers, O'Brien, is actually a member of the Brotherhood, but he can never bring it up to him, as there are spies for the thought police everywhere, and you don't know who is an informant or not. He also notices another one of his co-workers, a beautiful woman named Julia, but again, he doesn't say anything, as she could potentially be an informant for the thought police. Winston keeps a secret diary that he uses to write all of his criminal thoughts into, and begins to write about Julia and O'Brien a lot more. Eventually, Julia passes Winston a note that simply says, "I love you." And they begin having a covert love affair, always on the watch for an informant or a spy. They eventually rent a room together in a working-class neighborhood above a second-hand store, where Winston actually bought the diary. Their love affair continues on for quite some time, and Winston is becoming increasingly paranoid that they are going to be found out. Winston actually becomes so paranoid that he begins having nightmares of rats. He actually gets a message from his other co-worker, O'Brien, saying that he wants to meet at his apartment. O'Brien is a higher-level worker than Winston or Julia, and leads a life of luxury as a member of the inner party. But at his apartment, O'Brien reveals to Winston and Julia that he is actually a member of the Brotherhood, and that he hates the Party, going so far as to even give them a copy of the manifesto of the Brotherhood. Julie and Winston return to their apartment above the store, and they begin reading the book to each other when suddenly soldiers burst in and seize them and arrest them. They find out that not only O'Brien is actually a member of the thought police, but so is the owner of the second-hand store that they rented from. And all of that was simply a means to an end, to get them to commit an open act of rebellion. Winston and Julia are then taken to the Ministry of Love, where they endure months of torture and brainwashing. Let's pause it right here. At this point, Winston and Julia have been betrayed, their rebellion shattered, and they're taken to the Ministry of Love, a place where people are not loved at all. What happens next is chilling, powerful, and reveals just how far the Party will go to break someone's spirit, to truly capture the terrifying control of this world. Let's read a section from this part of the book. This scene will stay with you long after you hear it. He was much better. He was growing fatter and stronger every day, if it was proper to speak of days. The white light and the humming sound were the same as ever, but the cell was a little more comfortable than the others he had been in. There was a pillow and a mattress on the plank bed, and a stool to sit on. They had given him a bath, and they allowed him to wash himself fairly frequently in a tin basin. They even gave him warm water to wash with. They had given him new underclothes and a clean suit of overalls. They had dressed his varicose ulcer with soothing ointment. They had pulled out the remnants of his teeth and given him a new set of dentures. Weeks or months must have passed. It would have been possible now to keep count of the passage of time if he had felt any interest in doing so, since he was being fed at what appeared to be regular intervals. He was getting, he judged, 3 meals in the 24 hours. Sometimes he wondered dimly whether he was getting them by night or by day. The food was surprisingly good, with meat at every third meal. Once there was even a packet of cigarettes. He had no matches, but the never-speaking guard who brought his food would give him light. The first time he tried to smoke it made him sick, but he persevered and spun the packet out for a long time, smoking half a cigarette after each meal. They had given him a white slate with a stump of pencil tied to the corner. At first, he made no use of it. Even when he was awake, he was completely torpid. Often, he would lie from one meal to the next almost without stirring, sometimes asleep, sometimes waking into vague reveries in which it was too much trouble to open his eyes. He had long grown used to sleeping with a strong light on his face. It seemed to make no difference, except that one's dreams were more coherent. He dreamed a great deal all through this time, and they were always happy dreams. He was in the Golden Country, or he was sitting among enormous, glorious, sunlit ruins with his mother, with Julia, with O'Brien not doing anything, merely sitting in the sun, talking of peaceful things. Such thoughts as he had when he was awake were mostly about his dreams. He seemed to have lost the power of intellectual effort, now that the stimulus of pain had been removed. He was not bored. He had no desire for conversation or distraction. Merely to be alone, not to be beaten or questioned, to have enough to eat, and to be clean all over was completely satisfying. By degrees, he came to spend less time in sleep, but he still felt no impulse to get off the bed. All he cared for was to lie quiet and feel the strength gathering in his body. He would finger himself here and there, trying to make sure that it was not an illusion that his muscles were growing rounder and his skin tauter. Finally, it was established beyond a doubt that he was growing fatter. His thighs were now definitely thicker than his knees. After that, reluctantly at first, he began exercising himself regularly. In a little while he could walk 3 kilometers, measured by pacing the cell, and his bowed shoulders were growing straighter. He attempted more elaborate exercises, and was astonished and humiliated to find what things he could not do. He could not move out of a walk. He could not hold his stool out at arm's length. He could not stand on one leg without falling over. He squatted down on his heels and found that with agonizing pains in thigh and calf, he could just lift himself to a standing position. He lay flat on his belly and tried to lift his weight by his hands. It was hopeless. He could not raise himself a centimeter. But after a few more days, a few more meal times, even that feat was accomplished. A time came when he could do it 6 times running. He began to grow actually proud of his body and to cherish an intermittent belief that his face also was growing back to normal. Only when he chanced to put his hand on his bald scalp did he remember the seamed, ruined face that had looked back at him out of the mirror. His mind grew more active. He sat down on the plank bed, his back against the wall and the slate on his knees, and set to work deliberately at the task of re-educating himself. He had capitulated, that was agreed. In reality, as he saw now, he had been ready to capitulate long before he had taken the decision. From the moment when he was inside the Ministry of Love, and yes, even during those minutes when he and Julia had stood helpless while the iron voice from the telescreen told them what to do, he had grasped the frivolity, the shallowness of his attempt to set himself up against the power of the party. He knew now that for 7 years the thought police had watched him like a beetle under a magnifying glass. There was no physical act, no words spoken aloud that they had not noticed, no train of thought that they had not been able to infer. Even the speck of whitish dust on the cover of his diary they had carefully replaced. They had played soundtracks to him, shown him photographs. Some of them were photographs of Julia and himself. Yes, even. He could not fight against the party any longer. Besides, the party was in the right. It must be so. How could the immortal, collective brain be mistaken? By what external standard could you check its judgments? Sanity was statistical. It was merely a question of learning to think as they thought. Only. The pencil felt thick and awkward in his fingers. He began to write down the thoughts that came into his head. He wrote first in large, clumsy capitals. Freedom is slavery. Then, almost without a pause, he wrote beneath it, 2 and 2 make 5. But then there came a sort of check. His mind, as though shying away from something, seemed unable to concentrate. He knew that he knew what came next, but for the moment, he could not recall it. When he did recall it, it was only by consciously reasoning out what it must be. It did not 1984 come of its own accord. He wrote, God is power. He accepted everything. The past was alterable. The past never had been altered. Oceania was at war with Eastasia. Oceania had always been at war with Eastasia. Jones, Aronson, and Rutherford were guilty of the crimes they were charged with. He had never seen the photograph that disproved their guilt. It had never existed. He had invented it. He remembered remembering contrary things, but those were false memories, products of self-deception. How easy it all was. Only surrender, and everything else followed. It was like swimming against a current that swept you backwards however hard you struggled, and then suddenly deciding to turn round and go with the current instead of opposing it. Nothing had changed except your own attitude. The predestined thing happened in any case. He hardly knew why he had ever rebelled. Everything was easy except anything could be true. The so-called laws of nature were nonsense. The law of gravity was nonsense. If I wished, O'Brien had said, I could float off this floor like a soap bubble. Winston worked it out. If he thinks he floats off the floor, and if I simultaneously think I see him do it, then the thing happens, suddenly, like a lump of submerged wreckage breaking the surface of water. The thought burst into his mind. It doesn't really happen. We imagine it. It is hallucination. He pushed the thought under instantly. The fallacy was obvious. It presupposed that somewhere or other, outside oneself, there was a real world where real things happened. But how could there be such a world? What knowledge have we of anything, save through our own minds? All happenings are in the mind. Whatever happens in all minds truly happens. He had no difficulty in disposing of the fallacy, and he was in no danger of succumbing to it. He realized, nevertheless, that it ought never to have occurred to him. The mind should develop a blind spot whenever a dangerous thought presented itself. The process should be automatic, instinctive. Crime Stop, they called it in Newspeak. He set to work to exercise himself in Crime Stop. He presented himself with propositions. The party says the earth is flat. The party says that ice is heavier than water, and trained himself in not seeing or not understanding the arguments that contradicted them. It was not easy. It needed great powers of reasoning and improvisation. The arithmetical problems raised, for instance, by such a statement as 2 and 2 make 5 were beyond his intellectual grasp. It needed also a sort of athleticism of mind, an ability at one moment to make the most delicate use of logic, and at the next to be unconscious of the crudest logical errors. Stupidity was as necessary as intelligence, and as difficult to attain. All the while, with one part of his mind, he wondered how soon they would shoot him. Everything depends on yourself. O'Brien had said, but he knew that there was no conscious act by which he could bring it nearer. It might be 10 minutes hence, or 10 years. They might keep him 1984 for years in solitary confinement. They might send him to a labor camp. They might release him for a while, as they sometimes did. It was perfectly possible that before he was shot, the whole drama of his arrest and interrogation would be enacted all over again. The one certain thing was that death never came at an expected moment. The tradition, the unspoken tradition, somehow you knew it, though you never heard it said, was that they shot you from behind, always in the back of the head, without warning, as you walked down a corridor from cell to cell. One day, but one day, was not the right expression. Just as probably it was in the middle of the night. Once he fell into a strange, blissful reverie. He was walking down the corridor, waiting for the bullet. He knew that it was coming in another moment. Everything was settled, smoothed out, reconciled. There were no more doubts, no more arguments, no more pain, no more fear. His body was healthy and strong. He walked easily, with a joy of movement and with a feeling of walking in sunlight. He was not any longer in the narrow white corridors in the Ministry of Love. He was in the enormous sunlit passage, a kilometer wide, down which he had seemed to walk in the delirium induced by drugs. He was in the golden country, following the foottrack across the old rabbit-cropped pasture. He could feel the short, springy turf under his feet and the gentle sunshine on his face. At the edge of the field were the elm trees, faintly stirring, and somewhere beyond that was the stream where the dace lay in the green pools under the willows. Suddenly, he started up with a shock of horror. The sweat broke out on his backbone. He had heard himself cry aloud, "Julia, Julia, Julia, my love, Julia." For a moment, he had had an overwhelming hallucination of her presence. She had seemed to be not merely with him, but inside him. It was as though she had got into the texture of his skin. In that moment, he had loved her far more than he had ever done when they were together and free. Also, he knew that somewhere or other she was still alive and needed his help. He lay back on the bed and tried to compose himself. What had he done? How many years had he added to his servitude by that moment of weakness? In another moment, he would hear the tramp of boots outside. They could not let such an outburst go unpunished. They would know now, if they had not known before, that he was breaking the agreement he had made with them. He obeyed the party, but he still hated the party. In the old days, he had hidden a heretical mind beneath an appearance of conformity. Now he had retreated a step further. In the mind he had surrendered, but he had hoped to keep the inner heart inviolate. He knew that he was in the wrong, but he preferred to be in the wrong. They would understand that O'Brien would understand it. It was all confessed in that single foolish cry.
He would have to start all over again. It might take years. He ran a hand over his face, trying to familiarize himself with the new shape. There were deep furrows in the cheeks. The cheekbones felt sharp. The nose flattened. Besides, since 1984, last seeing himself in the glass, he had been given a complete new set of teeth. It was not easy to preserve inscrutability when you did not know what your face looked like. In any case, mere control of the features was not enough.
For the first time, he perceived that if you want to keep a secret, you must also hide it from yourself. You must know all the while that it is there, but until it is needed, you must never let it emerge into your consciousness in any shape that could be given a name. From now onwards, he must not only think right, he must feel right, dream right, and all the while he must keep his hatred locked up inside him, like a ball of matter which was part of himself and yet unconnected with the rest of him, a kind of cyst. One day, they would decide to shoot him. You could not tell when it would happen, but a few seconds beforehand, it should be possible to guess. It was always from behind, walking down a corridor. 10 seconds would be enough. In that time, the world inside him could turn over. And then suddenly, without a word uttered, without a check in his step, without the changing of a line in his face, suddenly, the camouflage would be down and bang, would go the batteries of his hatred. Hatred would fill him like an enormous roaring flame. And almost in the same instant, bang, would go the bullet, too late or too early. They would have blown his brain to pieces before they could reclaim it. The heretical thought would be unpunished, unrepented, out of their reach forever. They would have blown a hole in their own perfection. To die hating them, that was freedom. He shut his eyes. It was more difficult than accepting an intellectual discipline. It was a question of degrading himself, mutilating himself. He had got to plunge into the filthiest of filth. What was the most horrible, sickening thing of all? He thought of Big Brother. The enormous face, because of constantly seeing it on posters, he always thought of it as being a meter wide, with its heavy black mustache and the eyes that followed you to and fro, seemed to float into his mind of its own accord. What were his true feelings towards Big Brother? There was a heavy tramp of boots in the passage. The steel door swung open with a clang. O'Brien walked into the cell. Behind him were the waxen-faced officer and the black uniformed guards. "Get up," said O'Brien. "Come here." Winston stood opposite him. O'Brien took Winston's shoulders between his strong hands and looked at him closely. "You have had thoughts of deceiving me," he said. "That was stupid. Stand up straighter. Look me in the face." He paused and went on in a gentler tone. "You're improving. Intellectually, there is very little wrong with you. It is only emotionally that you have failed to make progress. Tell me, Winston, and remember, no lies. You know that I am always able to detect a lie. Tell me, what are your true feelings towards Big Brother?" "I hate him." "You hate him? Good. Then the time has come for you to take the last step. You must love Big Brother. It is not enough to obey him. You must love him." 1984. He released Winston with a little push towards the guards. "Room 101, he said. "That's just a glimpse into some of the most intriguing parts of 1984, and I believe it's definitely a book worth diving into. If you're curious about how Orwell's ideas play out, the rest of the story offers even more unsettling twists and insights into control, truth, and freedom. This book had an enormous cultural impact. It popularized the term Orwellian, which comes from George Orwell's name. Today, we use the term to describe anything that is full of propaganda, misinformation, and totalitarian control, much like the world in 1984. It also gave us the phrase, Big Brother, which you've probably heard before, maybe even on reality TV shows. In the book, Big Brother is the omnipresent leader of the party, constantly watching, listening, and monitoring everyone's actions. One of the most interesting symbols in this novel is Winston's fear of rats. On the surface, he's terrified of actual, physical rats, the rodents. But rat is also slang for a snitch or informant. This ties perfectly to Winston's paranoia about being reported to the party by anyone, even those closest to him. Another standout element is the party's use of newspeak. This manipulated language is propaganda in its purest form. It doesn't just eliminate words related to rebellion. It simplifies thought itself, stripping away complex ideas. For example, words like wonderful or terrible are replaced with plus good or double plus ungood. Entire ministries are renamed. Ministry of Love becomes Minilove, ironically the place of torture. Ministry of Peace becomes Minipax, responsible for war. Even more chilling, newspeak doesn't just erase words, it erases meanings. For example, the word equal no longer applies to rights or freedom. It's reduced to something purely mathematical. two things being the same. By removing the ability to express dissatisfaction, the party eliminates even the possibility of rebellion. After all, if you can't express it, can you even think it? If you're interested in the full book, or want me to make a complete reading video of this or more, be sure to hit that subscribe button and leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts and ideas.